Hi, I'm Funmi Fetto, and this is On Reflection, the beauty podcast with a global view on beauty. For those who are regular listeners, you will know that we normally have required reading at the top of the show and in praise of later on. However, today we have something very special. We are talking about the issue of fat. I am joined by Gina Tonic and Chloe Shepherd of the FatZine. This is a zine by fat people, for fat people, and for people who care about them, which to my mind should be absolutely everybody. Chloe, Gina, welcome to the show.
Hi.
Hey, thank you for having us.
Yes, thanks for having us.
You're welcome. Thank you. I'm super excited to have you here. I came across the FatZine a few months ago, and I'll be honest, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I thought it was an absolutely brilliant concept. And it's one that really forces us, I guess, to confront the bigotry and the biases we may all have around fat and around fat people. You feature a lot of work and writing from so many people, and I found the stories really eye-opening, others quite heartbreaking, but many of them are also joyous and funny and just gives us an insight into the fat lived experience. I also found it really powerful the way you use the word fat so brazenly and so openly, which feels very unusual for today's politically corrected society. We'll come to the use of the word fat in a bit. For now, I'd love you to tell everyone why and how you decided to come together to launch a zine in celebration of fat bodies and fat people.
I think this is an idea that both me and Chloe kind of had separately and then talked about together. We've been friends for years and we'd always end up at events for magazines, for art. I'd travel down to London because I'm based in Manchester, and obviously we connect on social media. We're both fat as well, so it's something that would come up in conversation quite often. When lockdown hit, I decided to go freelance with my writing. Chloe was moving back home, and we both kind of had this time and this space to be able to put the right amount of effort into creating the FatZine.
It was pretty much like Gina would post something on her story and be like, this has happened to me. Does it ever happen to anyone else that's fat? Blah, blah, blah. Like whether that be like a dating story or something to do with sex or doctors or something. We'd always sort of talk about that stuff, and eventually I think it just manifested into us being like, let's do this together and let's make a zine, because there must be so many other people with these feelings and no outlet for them if they don't have like a social media platform or something. We just decided to start it and see where it went, and it ended up going a lot further than we thought for the first issue, so it's been really great.
The reaction to the magazine has been quite something. I mean, you take in submissions for stories around existing as fat people, and you've had so many submissions that you've now had to launch an online blog. The stories, as I mentioned before, they are quite incredible, and I would urge anyone to go online and have a read, even following you on Instagram, the FatZine, very easy to remember. Were you quite surprised at how this has taken off and how many submissions you had and how many stories and how many people wanted to have their story heard?
I think it was a shock, and it wasn't, to be honest. There's so many fat people out there. It's more than like a third of the population of the whole planet. There's so many fat creatives that I've followed and admired for years. So when we put the feelers out, it kind of seemed natural that so many people would want to come forward and tell their stories. Obviously, we're very, very blessed that we are in a position that people know us and people trust us to share their stories safely and with respect.
After we'd launched, and then we started to really gain a following and get a lot of messages, and people reach out and be like, I didn't realise other people felt this way. This zine has helped me feel a lot less alone and stuff like that. That's been quite sweet, because that's stuff you can't predict and expect. It's been nice to see that the work we've put into it has helped other people, because the reason we sort of made it was because it's something we wish we'd have had when we were like fat and 15, didn't have any positive media to look up to that wasn't Tumblr, like Thinspiration blogs and things like that.
Yeah, I think it wasn't really the submissions that surprised us more than the reaction to it. And we got a lot of positive reaction from people who weren't plus size, which was really great, because I think I assumed that it would be quite an insular community, or quite a topic that people wouldn't relate to if they weren't fat or hadn't grown up fat or weren't fat now. But because of the reaction of people who weren't fat, I think that's what surprised me the most, like how much people were backing us.
For the most part, the beauty industry and society at large are still quite fat phobic. What is it about fat that you think that people are so scared of?
I think partly it's because they see how we get treated. Like sometimes I think some people are so afraid of being fat or having fat people included in campaigns because they see how they think about being fat and feel like, oh, I wouldn't want to feel that way about myself, sort of thing. Some people really treat it as though by giving you a hug, they're going to become obese or something. It's so ridiculous. And the exclusion from beauty industries and things like that, I think, are just because they're still wrapped up in that conventional, attractive European type of beauty that they just don't want to expand beyond that. They're excluding themselves from a market that makes up, like Gina said, a third of the population.
When people are celebrated for thinness, the only way that is going to keep going is if fatness is seen as negative. So people who work hard on their bodies, and even people who don't, people who are naturally very skinny, they have a position of power by not being fat. So in order to keep that power, they need to shit on plus size people, basically. I think it's especially annoying with the beauty industry or with maybe marketing or media that isn't fashion focused, because those things could so easily include plus size people because they don't come in sizes. I think that's what infuriates me the most about non-inclusion in those spaces.
A lot of people would state that their reason for their perpetual argument around or against fatness is entirely and solely health related. But there's another side that says it's just a veiled form of fat phobia and it has nothing to do with the concern of well-being of the individual.
Yeah, it's something that I've dealt with. I got posted a picture once. A photographer had taken a photo of me and it got reshared on this feminist account with like 1 million followers. And all the comments underneath were, I think I was in underwear, and all the comments were about, she's going to get diabetes, she's going to die of a heart attack, blah, blah, blah. Like they act like it's concern for your health, but yet they don't carry that same energy when it's a picture of like Phoebe Waller-Bridge lounging back with a glass of wine and smoking and stuff. Like nobody's commenting underneath that saying, oh, smoking's really bad for you, this is bad for your health. They're all resharing it and being like, wow, this is gold. This is what we should all be like because she's thin and beautiful and successful. If she was fat, it just wouldn't be the same way people reacted to it. I think on Twitter as well, like we see all the time people resharing pictures of skinny girls with cheeseburgers being like, oh my God, goals, or like, this is the girl I want to take on a date. Yet when it's fat people, the comments are like, SMH, you girls wonder why you're this fat. Where are people's medical degrees that are commenting this stuff under my pictures? Who actually knows about my health other than my doctors? It just doesn't make any sense to me, but people feel like they have this right to say this stuff to people. And I was in London cycling over Battersea Bridge with my boyfriend, and I was cycling on the path, which you're not really supposed to do, but it was late and there wasn't many people about. And this woman stopped me and she was like, you're too fat to be cycling on the bridge. And I just was like, fair enough. But also like, what do you think you're going to gain from saying that to me? I'm already cycling. I'm doing exercise. I'm trying to be active and healthy, which is what you want fat people to perform. I don't know. It's just this fake care that isn't really care. It's just a way for them to be hateful towards fat people that is infuriating.
Has that been a similar experience for you, Gina?
Yeah, I totally agree with Chloe. And I think my problem with it is twofold. I'm writing an article right now for Cosmo about weight bias in medicine. So I'm really well researched on this subject at the minute. 1 in 3 people with an obese BMI are actually medically healthy when you do the tests. 1 in 3 people with a regular BMI are unhealthy when you do the tests. So things about weight bias in medicine is that medicine has been rigged up to tell us that being fat is unhealthy when that isn't necessarily true. So when people bring up these things about, oh, well, being fat is unhealthy, so why should we support it? It's not true. Weight bias is such an invasive part of our society that's infected the medical field to make people believe that being fat is automatically unhealthy. The other side of it that I take problem with is the assumption that someone who is unhealthy is undeserving of being seen as a person. You wouldn't say that to someone who's in a wheelchair or someone who's differently abled. You wouldn't say that to someone who's got a disease. So why is it automatically a moral issue just because the person's fat? It's because the issue isn't that you're upset with them for being unhealthy. The issue is that you're upset with them for being fat because society has told you that being fat is wrong.
I want to get on to the word fat, and I mentioned that earlier. Interestingly, you guys have inadvertently made me feel more comfortable using that word openly. I feel like this was a 2-fingered flick to the body positive movement in many ways, which I feel sanitizes fat And still, without maybe realizing it, still leaves it somewhat shrouded in shame. This use of the word fat feels like a reclaiming and proud ownership of the word. Talk to me about the thinking behind this.
I think it's more that when I first started following people online who were talking about being fat and sharing their experiences, they always put a disclaimer that was like, fat isn't a bad word. It's literally a descriptive. It's no different to saying you have brown hair. It's just an attribute of you. It isn't what makes you, if that makes sense. So I started to get more comfortable with using it to describe myself. All of my friends who are fat sort of feel the same way, and it came together. We're trying to think of titles for the zine and eventually just settled on the FatZine because that is what it all is about. And fat isn't this negative word that we need to be scared of. And by taking it back and sort of knowing that you are fat, people can't use it against you in arguments and trying to belittle you online. They can't say, oh, you fat bitch or something, because it's like, yeah, that's exactly what I am. And I know that. Like, it's not a negative thing. Reclaiming that word is so important, but it's been done for so many years by other online activists and activists from like the 70s and stuff that would be almost doing them wrong by not having it called the FatZine if we tried to label it something else. But also I do completely understand about feeling fat is sort of shamed still by the body positive community, because especially as that has become so commercial, I feel like fatness is more of a tokenism in campaigns. I think, Gina, you tweeted about this the other day, that you were sick of campaigns using a fat model or like a plus size model to look diverse, but then when you look on their range, they actually don't go past like a size 14 or something.
Yeah, I did say that.
I think body positivity has become this online thing where girls who aren't, well, not just girls, like lots of people who haven't really ever not been able to buy their clothes in high street shops and who haven't felt the same kind of bias as fat people have, are like finding this place for themselves, which is great because obviously as a society, especially women, have been taught to hate their bodies and feel like there's something that needs to be fixed. But body positivity does take up this space that isn't really necessary when thin white bodies aren't shamed in the same way. Hopefully it will get better.
I agree. I think fat liberation is what started the body positivity movement, and it's really upsetting to see it sanitized and brought down to a hashtag that brands can use to sell bras. It might seem to someone who isn't maybe well versed on the subject as me and Chloe, because obviously we know so much about it, but it was like a fat manifesto by this fat liberation movement built of Black and Jewish fat women in the 70s, who were the people who first reclaimed the word and said that we should use it. And then in my time in the fat liberation community, in maybe the past 8 years, it's definitely been something that I have been very keen on making sure it's a neutral word, as Chloe said earlier. It's the same as being called tall, and it should be seen that way. And it's really empowering, to be honest, to use a word that so many people, when I would call myself fat, would go, "You're not fat, you're pretty." And then you would go, "Well, I'm both." There shouldn't be any negative connotations to fat. And when you add them to it by saying that I can't use that word, then you're making me feel worse about being fat, really, at the end of the day. And you're making a whole community feel worse about being fat. That word is so, so important for us, for our community, and for society to start changing its mind.
You mentioned where the movement started. You attributed that to Black women and Jewish women. And these are portions of society that have historically been marginalized in so many different ways. I noticed that you released a special double-sided poster of LaShawnee, who is something of a fat icon, and quite a bit of the profits went to her. You also donated quite a lot to the Black Lives Matter movement. And you also feature a diversity of people within your zine, especially as two white women. Why was it important for you to shine a light on fat Black bodies in particular?
Without fat Black bodies, there wouldn't be a FatZine. There wouldn't be us. There wouldn't be the body positive movement or the fat liberation movement. It was wholly started by these women, especially fat Black queer women in the 70s and again in riot girl culture in the 90s. And it would be such a disservice for us both to not acknowledge that and to not contribute back to that society that made us able to make the FatZine.
Your first issue contains lots of illustrations and art and interviews from the fat community, opening up about the fat experience. However, the overarching theme was self-isolation. When I read this, I didn't take this to mean it was necessarily or solely pandemic related. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'd love for you to share exactly what was meant by that and why you decided to base your first issue around this theme.
It definitely started because of lockdown, but I think when we both thought of the term isolation, it's a feeling that is definitely felt by fat people, regardless of what year it is, regardless of the 2020 lockdowns. Feeling isolated from a media that doesn't represent you, feeling isolated even in friendship groups where you're the only fat person, or family units where you're the only fat person. I think going through the world on your own, having no media growing up that represents you or even talks about your experience, makes you feel isolated. And what I found really joyous when we were putting together the first issue is not everyone took the self-isolation theme to be a negative. A lot of people submitted work that was celebrating how they used lockdown and isolation and being on their own to learn to love and respond to their body. And I thought that was so powerful.
Yeah, I agree. I think when we first put a call out for submissions, we were just trying to think of a theme that everybody would be able to relate to, especially obviously fat people. And isolation just made the most sense because of the state of the world. And like Gina said, it is so often how we feel and how we're made to feel, even in like doctors and medical situations, and every facet of life for fat people can be so isolating. So it just sort of made sense. I mean, I wrote an essay for it that is more about fetishism and sex than it is about isolation, but then that still is an issue that is something I dealt with alone for so long. So it is to do with isolation. Some of the work has multiple meanings, but all can tie together to make up this experience of fatness where we all sort of feel isolated at times.
How do we normalize fat in a society where thinness is lauded? How do you personally manage to hold on to your sense of self when the pressures and the messaging, subliminal and otherwise, to lose weight are so overwhelming and they're so omnipresent?
I think I just got to a point where I started to tune it out and would say to people, like, can we just stop talking about Slimming World or like diet talk? Because I am trying to train my brain to not feed into that anymore. From the age of 8, my family have tried to get me to lose weight, and, you know, they haven't meant to upset me. It's always been for my own good or whatever, but it has had such negative impacts on the way I grew up and the way I think about myself. And I think I got to maybe 21 after I'd lived in London for a while and made friends within the fat community that I was like, actually, I can actively choose to like not engage with this behavior and try to normalize it so that my existence isn't something that's constantly in limbo to finally exist when I'm thin. I felt like my whole life was almost just waiting for that point until I decided, like, actually, no, we can choose to not pay attention to that stuff. Like all of this media that's telling us to lose weight, there's other ways to live. And it's about carving out those spaces and finding those spaces and being able to exist within them.
Do you think we can ever normalize fat?
I want to say yes, but also I know how hated it is. And I know that there's a whole industry that profits millions, if not billions, from this hatred of fat people. So I feel like it's going to be an ongoing thing for forever, but it's going in the right direction, I think. And hopefully one day it can be a way that we're all sort of, you know, a body is a body. And as long as we're all happy to an extent and being good people, that is what matters, not the way we look. Hopefully fatness can be normalized.
I agree. I think it's a fight, and it's a fight that's going to be ongoing, but I feel that it's going to be one of those ones where people look back in 50 years and are like, bloody hell, did we really talk about each other like that? The same way that maybe we might look back on how newspapers or media used to talk about queer people. I think it'll be one of those, but it's going to be a long journey. It's going to be a fight, and it's going to be a fight on a social level, but also on a personal level. I know that I've always struggled with weight loss. I've spoken about it quite openly, like I have an eating disorder. It's such a double-edged sword when you're a fat person with one, because people don't really see the effects of how it's going on with you on a physical level. So you have to be very open about how it's affecting you mentally. What worked best for me to overcome media that is so driven towards weight loss culture was to create my own spaces where that wasn't even mentioned, like Chloe said, and create my own spaces and worlds where fat positivity was at the forefront, not just fat neutrality. So like I made a rule for myself. I wasn't going to follow any thin people for about 2 years on Instagram. So my feed's pretty much just all fat people, and it's so liberating to have that representation. And I feel like representation is so, so important for anyone on the margins of society to feel more comfortable within themselves. I also made other decisions in my life. So I wouldn't hang out with people who feel that weight loss is important to them. I've told my family I wouldn't want to talk about it. Mainly just curating myself a feed and a space and a bubble, really, where I feel safe. And I remember now, I also made a rule for myself that I'd stop having sex with thin people, which really changed the way that I view myself a lot as well, because I was constantly comparing my body to my thinner partners. And by having fat partners and fat friends and having fat media constantly on my screen, it became so much more normalized to see fat not just as normal, but as a positive thing.
So tell me, what have you got coming up next?
It's our second issue coming up. Submissions opened yesterday and are open until the middle of January. And we've asked for all the submissions to be on the theme of love, because we want to release it on Valentine's Day next year. And I think love is an important topic, especially to do with fat people, because fat relationships, especially positive fat relationships, aren't really shown on TV shows and in books and things like that. So I'm hoping it's going to be a really eye-opening issue.
Although the first issue isn't really negative or positive, I think it's really important to create a space that is positive. Like I said, it's so much more liberating when something is seen as positive rather than neutral. I think that's what we want to do with issue 2. We've not mentioned it, but we also have postcards for sale that we're raising money for UK food banks after the recent news with Marcus Rashford. And we're hopefully extending the blog and having more diverse work on there as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Gina and Chloe. It's been phenomenal having you on the show.
Thank you so much for having us and for giving us a platform to speak about these things. It's so important and we really, really appreciate it.
That's it for this week's special episode. Please do visit us on orbpodcast.com. And if you haven't done so already, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter. My thanks again to our guests, Gina and Chloe from the FatZine, and to you for listening to On Reflection. On Reflection is a Battersea Podcast production.